Well, thank you very much for this invitation. So before I give my talk, I just want to say a few words as President of the International Society for Autism Research. The first point I want to make is that the regional IMFAR, the Regional International Meeting for Autism Research, is very important to our society. This is the Africa Regional IMFAR, embedded within the larger Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Conference. This is the second regional meeting that INSAR has held. I think it's been a terrific success. I've really enjoyed listening to how we understand autism, how we understand autism research in low and middle income communities. I want to thank Petrus and Naufal Gadour for organizing this conference and the Africa Regional IMFAR, and just take 1 minute to ask you to applaud the organizers. So the other point I want to make is that the International Society for Autism Research wants to know what we can be doing for you. We want to know how the society, which has traditionally been centered in North America, can be more global, how we can promote autism research in Africa, but also globally. So as president, I'd be delighted to hear from you. You can email me. You can email me through the International Society for Autism Research. Please give me suggestions. I've been picking up a lot of suggestions at this meeting today on what we can be doing for you. Okay, let me move to my keynote speech. I'm guessing that the big green button, thank you. My topic really relates to language, how we talk about autism, and there's some discussion even in the previous talk by Bruno about whether we think of mental health conditions as diseases or not. I'm going to be talking about this now quite widely discussed notion of neurodiversity and how it applies to autism, and whether this concept of neurodiversity might actually be quite revolutionary, not just for our field in autism, but also for the field of psychiatry more broadly. So you all recognize these books, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, whether we're talking about DSM-2, DSM-3, DSM-4, or where we are now in DSM-5. The books contain a long list of so-called mental disorders. We've come to accept the language of disorder as if these are the entities, the diagnoses that we should be referring to. But there is a choice of language and terminology. And what I want to do in this talk is consider the notion of neurodiversity and consider each of these terms. So disorder is often a term that's used when a medical condition causes suffering and is wholly negative. The term disease, as Bruno mentioned in the last talk, is often used when a disorder has a known etiology. The term disability usually refers to an individual being below average on some measure of functioning, whether it's psychological or physical. And then, of course, there's the term difference, which we're beginning to recognize is just as important as the other three terms, and which is all about recognizing variation in the population. So most of you will have heard about the book Neurotribes that was published by Steve Silberman, a journalist in California. But you notice that the subtitle of his book, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity, many people recognize or regard his book as almost a manifesto for this new debate about neurodiversity. You can also see an image of the scientist Henry Cavendish, who in the 18th century discovered hydrogen. But there's a whole chapter in Steve's book basically describing Henry Cavendish as somebody who avoided social interaction, hated mixing with people, and just wanted to do scientific experiments in the solitude of his own house. He even made great efforts to avoid meeting anybody within his own house. Interested in objects, interested in nature, but not interested in people. And really the question is, how do we make space for this kind of diversity? Here's a slide which tells you how common autism is. It's data that comes from the US, likely to be true in many different countries, although we need more epidemiology across the globe. But notice that the research in 2014 comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So autism, now 1 in 68 children in the US, very similar sorts of rates being reported in my country, in the UK, and in other countries. But nevertheless, it's coming from a Center for Disease Control. And you can see that autism is more common in boys than girls. In that 2014 data, the sex ratio was 4 boys for every 1 girl being diagnosed. These days, we're now recognizing that females on the autism spectrum may be under-recognized, and that the true sex ratio may be closer to 3 males for every 1 female, or maybe even 2 males for every 1 female. But this notion about difference, here we've got a kind of archetypal image of a child with autism. Tends to be a boy, but as my last slide showed, we may be missing many girls. But what is he doing? He's playing alone. That's part of the diagnosis that individuals on the autism spectrum struggle to socialize, struggle to communicate. He's also doing something which I would describe as intelligent. He's making patterns, lining up his toy cars. And of course, those of you who know children with autism, who live with someone with autism, or if you have autism yourself, you know how distressed the person with autism can be or can become if their perfect order gets disrupted by somebody else in the family. The autism community come up with various ways to describe themselves, and this is a poster from one of the self-advocacy groups where they're saying, we, autistic people, are different, but we're not less, we're not inferior, we're not a pathology, we don't have a disease, we want to be respected for being different, and they chose as their metaphor biodiversity. We know that not all fruit come in the same sizes and shapes and colors and tastes, and the same with neurodiversity. So neurodiversity, the essence of it, is that there isn't a single way to be normal. There are many ways for the brain to develop, and we should be respecting that diversity. What the autism communities are asking for under the rubric of neurodiversity is acceptance, support, and respect. So let's see what the science says in terms of, is there evidence for difference rather than disease or disorder? Many of you know this study. It comes from Karen Pierce's lab in San Diego. What she did with her team was to look at toddlers coming to a clinic for neurodevelopmental conditions. And the toddlers were shown 2 different types of movie, either geometric patterns or a human face. What she found was that the kids who ended up with a diagnosis of autism tended to look more at the patterns than at the human face, and that even more striking, that if a child looked for more than 70% of the time at the geometric patterns rather than the human face, the likelihood that they had autism was 100%. This is a very striking finding. Of course, it's a clinic sample, so we should take the findings with a pinch of salt, because the accuracy levels might not be that high in a community sample. But nevertheless, when we just look at the results, it's about difference, that these autistic kids are showing a difference in what they're interested in, patterns rather than faces. We know that autism is partly genetic, in that if a family has 1 child with autism, the likelihood that there's another child with autism in the same family is something like 20%, much higher than the general population prevalence of autism. And we know that there are many, many genes involved in autism. So one source of information for the genetics of autism that many of you will consult is the Safari website, and they have reported as many as 700 genetic associations with autism, so many genes involved in autism. The list here shows the so-called high confidence genes, the ones that can be replicated and which seem to be robust findings. And scientists argue whether there are about 30 or about 70 of these genes which we can reliably say are linked to autism, and many of these are expressed in the brain. But these genes are found in the small red slice of this pie chart. They tend to be the so-called rare genetic variants that only account for about 3% of autism. So these are the genes which some people regard as disease genes, mutations. They're very rare, but they can be reliably associated with a small percentage of people on the autism spectrum. But the genetics of autism is much more complex than that. It does involve rare variants, but it also involves common variants. And this brings us back to the theme of neurodiversity, because the larger red chunk of this pie chart is all about the genetics that we all carry, polymorphisms, where genes come in different varieties and which have been associated with autism, but far less reliably. We have trouble replicating the polymorphisms from common genetic variants in autism, but we know that they must play an important part. So if common variation, genetic variation in the population, is linked to autism, is autism better thought about, better characterized as simply part of the differences we see, the diversity we see in the gene pool? The pie chart also tells you that autism isn't completely genetic, because some 41% of the variance in autism is not accounted for by genetic factors, but rather by environmental factors. We know about the importance of environmental factors because of twins like these two sisters, where one has autism and one doesn't. They're identical twins, which means that they share 100% of their genes. So if autism was 100% genetic, if one has autism, both should have it. The fact that you can find so-called discordant twin pairs of this kind shows the importance of environmental factors. And now we are exploring the environmental factors that might operate on the gene, so-called epigenetic factors, to interact with genetic predisposition. In our lab, we've been looking at one particular environmental factor, which is prenatal hormones, particularly the sex steroid hormones like testosterone, that the fetus is exposed to in utero, which comes by variation in the population. Males have more of it than females, and it turns out that kids who go on to develop autism have slightly more of these prenatal sex steroid hormones in utero than kids in the general population. But this is all part of the natural variation, in this case of hormone level exposure, that we see in the general population. What about other examples from the science of autism which might be relevant to this idea of autism being simply a difference rather than a disease or a disorder? Well, this is work from Eric Courchain's lab, again in San Diego. Some of you know these, I think now classic studies. On the left, a graph showing rate of growth of the brain. And it turns out that for a subgroup of kids with autism, the brain is simply growing faster, it is larger in the first 5 years of life. So the blue line shows typically developing children. This shows you total grey matter. The red line shows you kids with autism. and each child has had at least 2 brain scans so that you can plot rate of growth, to me this doesn't shout out disorder or disease. It's simply showing kids with autism are showing variation, in this case, in brain size and rate of growth of the brain. Courchain's lab has also been involved in post-mortem studies, and another one of his now, I think, very important findings was that in the autistic brain, if you look at it at post-mortem, you find more neurons. His result was 65% more neurons or individual nerve cells in the prefrontal cortex. Again, this isn't shouting out disease or disorder, it's shouting out about difference and variation. In fact, the next slide goes down to the individual neuron level, this study by Tang and colleagues in 2014. So what we're looking at now is individual nerve cells, one from a typical brain, one from an autistic brain, after the person has died. And what you can see if you look at the autistic neuron, if I can put it that way, is many more of those white dots running up and down the nerve cell, just looking at it with the naked eye. Each of those white dots is the location of a dendritic spine, or where the neuron forms a connection with its neighboring neuron. So one interpretation of the post-mortem data, this particular method in neuroscience, is that the autistic brain has more connections than the typical brain. And this has been interpreted by some scientists that may be a reflection of reduced apoptosis or selective cell death as part of the natural process of development in the brain. So the graph that you see in the middle of these 2 images shows you that in typical individuals you have a reduction in the number of these dendritic spines with age. It's part of the pruning that goes on in development, and there's less of a reduction in the autistic brains. So what we're seeing is difference, but not necessarily evidence of disorder or disease. This is a more recent methodology that's been used, diffusion tensor imaging, by a London group, Christine Ecker and colleagues, where they're looking at how you can divide white matter tracts in the brain, so connections in the brain, into long range and short range. The image on the right shows you long range connections in the brain. The image on the left shows you short range connections in the brain. And it turns out that in the autistic brain, when you're using MRI, but particularly DTI as your method, you see more of the short range connections in the autistic brain than the long range connections. Again, to me, this isn't an indicator of disease, it's an indicator of difference, that the brain in people with autism, perhaps right from the beginning of life, but certainly as we continue to image the brain across life, is different, and that some of these differences in brain organization may give rise to differences in how the individual processes information and is sensitive to different environments. Which leads me to this study. We know that people with autism, many of them show sensory hypersensitivity. They're simply much more sensitive, whether it's to light or to sound or to touch or to smell or to taste. And this study back from 2011 shows that if you put people with autism and a control group, typical individuals, into functional MRI scanning, blindfolded, and you just play them a sound, an auditory input, you see a bigger response in the auditory cortex in people with autism than in a typical person. So the MRI is supporting the notion that people with autism tell us very clearly that they are hypersensitive to sensory information. But is this a sign of disease or disorder, or is it simply part of the variation that we would see in any population? They are extremely sensitive. That sensitivity to sensory information can sometimes translate into superior attention to detail. The psychologists in the room will recognize this is the embedded figures test, where you have to find that cube as quickly as you can in the overall design up above. People with autism are super quick and super accurate at spotting the part within the whole, maybe a reflection of that sensory hypersensitivity. But is this evidence of disease or disorder, or is this simply a different processing style, different perceptual style, a different cognitive style that we're seeing in people with autism? Interestingly, when people with autism do that task during a functional MRI scan, they show less activity in the visual cortex, the posterior parietal cortex, than typical individuals. So they're achieving a superior performance whilst showing less brain activity in those brain regions. Differences, but not necessarily disorder or disease. People with autism also report a stronger interest in systems. I mentioned patterns earlier on, but if you use a questionnaire which asks about a variety of systems, whether it's the weather or mechanical systems or any other kind of system, people with autism report a stronger interest in systematic information than do people without autism. Where is the evidence here for a disease if they're simply reporting a difference in interests in different aspects of the environment? Nowadays we talk a lot about the spectrum, and our group developed something called the AQ, the Autism Spectrum Quotient, as a way to try and measure the autism spectrum, at least in individuals who could fill in questionnaires or parents who could fill in questionnaires about their child. What that metric showed us is that there are autistic traits that are distributed right through the population. So the dotted line in that bell curve show autistic traits in the whole population. We all have some autistic traits. The solid line show you people who have a diagnosis, and they too show variation in the number of autistic traits they have, but they're simply shifted to the right, on a spectrum of traits that runs right through the population. To me, again, strong evidence for variation in the population. People with autism simply being at an extreme end of that spectrum of differences. What we found when we gave that measure of autistic traits to students in our university was that scientists, on average, showed more autistic traits than students in the humanities. The scientists didn't have autism, but they had more autistic traits. So a link between aptitude in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and the number of autistic traits you have. We found more than 10 years ago that if you ask students in the mathematics department about whether they have a diagnosis of autism, more students in mathematics report a diagnosis of autism than students in the humanities. So here we're seeing an association between a diagnosis and a talent, in this case of in the area of mathematics. This is making us rethink the genetics, the etiology, and how we characterize the nature of autism. More than 20 years ago, we looked at the fathers and grandfathers of children with autism and found that they were disproportionately represented in the field of engineering. So, compared to children who were typically developing. So again, an association between people who work in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and the condition of autism. When we see these kinds of links, it raises questions about whether we should be thinking about autism as a disease or a disorder, or whether we should be thinking about it as linked to differences in the population. So just last year, we had the opportunity to replicate some of the findings from 10 and even 20 years ago in big data. We asked people to take the AQ, the Autism Spectrum Quotient, and we had 500,000 respondents. What we found was, first of all, a replication of a widely reported sex or gender difference in autistic traits, that males in the population, on average, show a small but significantly different, higher number of autistic traits than females. That's the graph on the left. But the graph on the right showing that people who work in STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths, show a higher number of autistic traits compared to those who do not work in STEM occupations. Again, what we're finding then is an association between autistic traits, the number that you have, and your pattern of interests and aptitudes in the population. Evidence, I think, of diversity. So this led us to ask a question: is autism more common in regions that are particularly rich in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? And we carried out a study in the Netherlands, looking particularly at the rates of autism in 3 Dutch cities: Eindhoven, which is the sort of Silicon Valley of the Netherlands, where 30% of the jobs are in IT, compared to Utrecht and Haarlem, which are not IT hubs. And what we found was that the rate of autism in Eindhoven was more than twice as high as in the other 2 Dutch cities, again suggesting an association between patterns of aptitude in the population. Some people choose or end up working in areas like STEM, and the likelihood of autism in their families. So I think I've shown you quite a lot of evidence that we can think about autism from the perspective of diversity and difference. But I don't want you to go away from this talk without recognizing the importance of disability and disorder. Autism, without doubt, entails disability. There are many ways to show this. I'm just going to show you one way, that on tests of emotion recognition, this is the EYES test that our group developed, but there are many measures of emotion recognition. People with autism struggle to read emotions, to read behavioral cues of other people's states of mind. This test reveals a gender difference in the general population, I think part of diversity. So in that bar chart, you see women scoring on average higher than men in the general population, and both men and women with autism scoring below average, so evidence of disability when it comes to reading emotions from faces. And we all know that if you struggle with reading faces, struggle with reading emotions, that's going to have a direct impact on your ability to socialize, to interact, to understand communication. We also see this supported by MRI evidence that when people are reading the eyes from someone's face to decode what they might be feeling, people with autism show less activity in one part of the brain, the left inferior frontal gyrus, compared to so-called neurotypical individuals. So one example of disability, and then we could point to many others. Interestingly, we just published this year, again using large data, some evidence for variation in the general population on the EYES test, this time from 80,000 people who took the test. So the normal distribution that you can see in the center of these 3 graphs shows you performance on this test in 80,000 people who were also enrolled in the company 23andMe, so they also had been genotyped. And what we found was in women only, there was one particular common genetic variant on chromosome 3, which was significantly associated with your score in terms of reading emotions on the EYES test. So variation in the ability to read emotions no doubt has multiple sources, both social, environmental, but also partly genetic. So should we also be thinking about disease and disorder in relation to autism? And this is where I'm going to be closing shortly, but I do think that there are elements of autism which are appropriately understood in terms of disorder and disease, and I've just listed some of those symptoms that we can think of here. Epilepsy is, I think, a very clear example. Epilepsy causes suffering. Epilepsy is wholly negative. If there was a cure or a way of preventing it, we would want that. So some aspects of autism we should recognize as warranting the term disorder or disease. And of course, there are some forms of epilepsy where we know the etiology. I think another very clear example would be gastrointestinal pain. This is associated with autism in different studies, from as few as 9% of people with autism to, in other studies, as high as 70% of people with autism. And it is a miserable symptom to have to live with. If there were ways of curing it, of preventing it, we would want to look for those sorts of treatments. So there are aspects of autism which I think do warrant the term disorder or disease. One might argue about some of the other symptoms that I've listed here. For example, being minimally verbal. We're not quite sure what percentage of people on the autism spectrum are minimally verbal, where they've got very little functional language. But those of you who work in speech therapy or in other kinds of therapy no doubt would argue that if we found ways to promote language development in these individuals, that would be desirable, because the person is at a severe disadvantage in our society if they lack language or much language. And the last example of a symptom that I've listed here, which I think you could reasonably argue qualifies for disease or disorder, would be self-injury. Very distressing for families, often very distressing for the individuals. We don't really understand, after all these years of research, the different types of causes of self-injury. Is it simply the frustration of not being able to communicate? Is it simply things that are going on around the individual which are causing the individual high levels of stress? Or is there more of a biological nature to the mechanisms driving it? Certainly associated with a significant proportion of people on the autism spectrum, and we should be looking for ways to reduce that kind of distress. So these are examples, I think, where features of autism may be negative, may be best described as diseases or disorder, but that doesn't mean that autism itself should be labeled in the same way, that there is scope for also understanding autism in terms of difference and neurodiversity. My last example of where we could properly think of autism as a disorder is in terms of the high rates of suicidality that are now being reported by adults with autism. In our own clinic in Cambridge, we did a survey of 400 patients who were coming to a clinic for a late diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism. We found that 2/3 of them reported suicidal thoughts. 1/3 of them had reported a suicide plan or attempt. These are distressingly high rates. These are an indication that many individuals on the autism spectrum grow up to develop what I think of as secondary depression, where the depression may well be preventable with the right support, but sadly many of these individuals have not had the right support, have felt isolated, have felt devalued, have felt excluded, and have felt isolated, felt without support and developed depression. If depression can lead to suicide, then clearly we're talking about something which is a serious disorder or even disease. And again, we should be finding ways to prevent these secondary aspects of autism. So I want to wrap up with just one image of how we can pull these themes together. And that is talking about a therapy which is low cost to implement and which is called Lego therapy. The reason why I think it brings a lot of these ideas together is that in Lego therapy, you encourage the child to do what they enjoy. And many kids with autism love Lego because it is a system. You can construct things, you can make patterns, you can think about it in very mechanical terms, or in terms of color, shape, size, even mathematics. But when you bring kids with autism together to play Lego, you're enabling them to socialize whilst they're doing something that they enjoy and where they feel some self-confidence. What we found is in a trial of Lego therapy, kids on the autism spectrum improved in their social interactions, their eye contact, their turn-taking, compared to kids who were not in the Lego therapy trial, probably because they were doing something where they felt it built on their strengths, not on their difficulties. So making space for kids who enjoy, for example, patterns, systems, and objects, and enabling them to improve in some of the areas where they struggle, where they have disabilities, might be an interesting way to think about how we can reduce disability whilst respecting diversity. I'm going to invite you to visit our website if you want more information about some of the studies that I've mentioned, and finally invite you, as many of you as can make it, to come to the International Society for Autism Research annual meeting 2018, which will be in Rotterdam next year. Thank you very much.